Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Bustamante. In this video, we're going to talk about 7.2, which is natural selection. Basically, we're going to try and describe the importance of phenotypic variation in a population. Why is it important to have that variation? Now, some of these things we already touched on in 7.1 if you already watched it, so hopefully a lot of this is kind of a review of concepts of things we talked about a little bit already. So first, what's genetic variation? Well, it describes the genotypic and phenotypic differences in individuals in a population, right? We know that different phenotypes can lead to different adaptations, and of course, different genotypes lead to those different phenotypes, right? So due to natural selection, individuals with more favorable traits are more likely to survive and therefore reproduce. So we start to see those traits become more prominent in a population over long periods of time. Genetic variation increases the probability a population of organisms will survive under changing environmental conditions, right? Okay, so we talked briefly that the environment influences what adaptations are beneficial or harmful, right? So why do you want to have variation, right? If one thing makes you more likely to survive? Well, when we look at the big picture, right, having variation makes our overall population of our species more likely to survive long term, right? Because the environment changes, if we have variety in our population, it means our species is more likely to be able to survive changes because there are differences, right? So when we look at all these ladybugs here, we might say like, why would you have a purple ladybug? Well, we might not see purple ladybugs where we live, but perhaps there's some benefit to that phenotype where you find that purple ladybug versus a red one or something else, right? So having a variety in a population can be good. It can be helpful to the survival of that species. So environments change, right? Selective pressures, we say, influence this. This refers to any biotic or abiotic factor that influences survivability. This might be disease that could hit, or predation, right? What eats it, or the climate changing, or the food availability. All of these things are going to help select for what organisms have advantageous traits, right? And environments introduce different selective pressures on different populations, right? When it changes, what can survive? What is better fit? When we look at the coral reef, right? Maybe it used to look like this. Now it looks like this. Do we see all these same organisms? Probably not, because the environment has changed. So I want to talk about some real life examples of natural selection. And one of the most commonly talked about is these peppered moths. So in England, there were these peppered moths, and they had a variety of colors. Some of them were light, some of them were dark, some of them were kind of in between. They were sort of spotted. So after the Industrial Revolution, there was lots of soot from coal burning factories and homes, and everything kind of looked darker than normally because it was covered in soot. So dark colored moths were actually more camouflaged in this situation, and light colored moths were not, right? They would show up more against the backdrop. So what do we see? Well, the darker colored moths were more likely to survive and reproduce. And over time, they became more common. After, however, the Clean Air Act, the air started to become lighter and cleaner again, and the phenotype switched as to which one would be more beneficial, right? Now, all of a sudden, lighter colored moths were more likely to survive, and darker colored moths were more easy to find, right? And so we saw that environmental pressures changed which population was more prominent, or which, phenotype was more prominent in a given environmental condition. When we talk about these things, sometimes we're talking about fitness, okay? Fitness refers to the reproductive success over generations, right? Phenotypes that decrease your chance of survival and reproduction negatively impact the fitness of an organism. Any phenotype that increases changes the survival and reproduction positively and positively impacts fitness. So what do we mean? Overall fitness of individuals impacts the fitness of a population as a whole. Sometimes we'll talk about actually the fitness of an individual, But what does that really contribute to? It contributes to how that population is likely to survive. So when we think about phenotypes and their adaptations, right, one way to just think about this, Arctic animals and desert animals look kind of different to us, right? They have different adaptations that help make them more fit for their given environment, aka they can survive and pass on those traits to the next generation. Another kind of real life example of natural selection is DDT resistance. DDT was commonly used insecticide to combat insect-borne disease. Basically, it killed a lot of bugs that were causing disease, specifically mosquitoes and malaria. But it was later banned in the US in 1972, has some kind of harmful side effects, you could say, with it. So DDT, however, is still used in some countries to combat malaria, which spreads through mosquitoes. So DDT can kill the mosquitoes, right? But due to natural variation in the population, some of the insects, some individual insects, would become resistant to DDT. And so those individuals that were resistant to DDT would not be killed by the DDT, and then they would survive and they would reproduce, right? So what was the problem with this when you're trying to get rid of those organisms, right, is that all of a sudden now you have a population that is resistant to this insecticide that you're trying to use on it. So this doesn't just happen with DDT, it can happen with all insecticides, herbicides, and antibiotics, right? That's why we talk about antibiotic resistant bacteria. Basically, things that we used to be able to use to kill something will no longer work. So we see this with bacteria and antibiotic resistance, right? If we apply antibiotics typically to bacteria, they will die, but there are probably a couple bacteria that have this resistance to this antibiotic, and they'll survive. And over time, right, we start to see that that population that's resistant to that bacteria will become our majority population here. And so we see that change in phenotype of bacteria even. Last example here is sickle cell anemia, okay? So sickle cell anemia is basically where your blood cells cannot carry enough oxygen that you would normally like. But when we look at sickle cell anemia and its prevalence, right, well, we see that there are certain places where malaria, again, carried by mosquitoes, can be transmitted to humans, right? These are areas where malaria is really prevalent, right? And then we look at areas where we say the HBS allele, which is the sickle cell allele, is also prevalent, right? Because you might say, why would this allele stay around in a population if it's not really good, right? You want your blood to be able to carry oxygen. Well, it turns out being heterozygous for the sickle cell gene, the HBS allele, is actually benefiting individuals who live in areas that malaria is pretty prevalent because it provides some resistance to malaria. So when we look at this correlation, we see that the frequency of this allele being present kind of relates to where malaria is also mostly present in populations. So there is certain advantages to having this heterozygous gene, which is why it kind of still stays around in a population depending on where you live. In fact, lots of people in other parts of the world, this sickle cell gene still is fairly common because of their ancestry and where a specific group of people might have originated, right? And this gene being prevalent in the population still. So even though it seems kind of negative, it has some sort of benefit to the population in certain areas. I hope that gives you some examples of natural selection and hopes you understand it a little bit better. Have a great day.